Ladies, gentlemen, and fallen Chaos Warriors, as always, I am Cosmic, and the end times are nigh as it's time to finally review Total War Warhammer, a real-time strategy game developed by Creative Assembly and published by Sega. Now, I am giving away a free copy of the game, so stay tuned to the end of the video for details on how to win that game. The Total War series has always been known as a gripping real-time strategy that has always been set in a historical basis such as Rome or feudal Japan as in Shogun. Creative Assembly are turning a new chapter, however, with their first ever Total War game set in a fictional fantasy universe. And what better of a universe to choose for a Total War game than the Warhammer franchise? Total War Warhammer has been something that I have been cautiously awaiting for a very long time and asking for even longer. The past few Total War games have been somewhat disappointing in varied forms, like Rome 2 in particular. The idea of a Warhammer-themed Total War is something that I would think both fans of both IPs have waited for such a long time. However, the implementation of a Warhammer-specific theme, mechanics, and unique units was something that I was unsure Creative Assembly would have been able to pull off in a Total War game and retain a high standard to both IPs. The Warhammer Fantasy IP is something that doesn't get many games compared to that of the 40k franchise, even though it is prime real estate for many genres, including RTSs. Now, the last RTS set in the IP was Mark of Chaos back in 2006, which was a mediocre game at best. Recently, however, things have started to pick up with a string of well-received releases, including Fat Shark's Vermintide and Rogue Factor's Mordheim. Lore-wise, Total War Warhammer takes place during the end times period of the Warhammer universe. Chaos forces are rising in the north under the leadership of Archon the Everchosen. Emperor Karl Franz seeks to unify his position as the head of the Empire. Manfred von Karstein has returned to raise his undead armies. The Orcs are always seeking more war, and the steadfast dwarves continue to seek retribution for the slights against them. Now, this is the first in a trilogy of Total War Warhammer games, and as such, Creative Assembly have opted to focus solely on the Old World region. This in turn has refined the scope that Total War players will be used to in terms of available factions and the overall longevity of campaigns. Now, the base game offers the ability to play 4 factions, with the Warriors of Chaos being DLC, which is free with pre-orders and purchases within the first week. Now, Total War has always been infamous with Day 1 DLC and a string of DLCs that just were not good or clever ideas. However, this one just seems to hurt a little bit more due to the fact that the game does have a refined scope. Having the Greeks, for example, locked behind DLC in Rome 2 was less of a big deal because there were so many other factions to choose from. However, with so few factions to choose from and each faction in Total War Warhammer being so unique, you're essentially locking a fifth of the game behind a paywall on day 1, and that's just something I refuse to accept as being okay. With that being said, let's dive into the game, and first let's talk about the factions. Total War Warhammer is unique from the get-go. Each faction has its own units, technology trees, heroes, and most importantly, mechanics. Each faction essentially has its own unique playstyle, which is pretty unprecedented in Total War. While in the historical games you would play to the strengths of your certain factions' units, options such as, one faction may have more spearmen or specialized spearmen or more varied ranged units, each faction in Total War Warhammer not only has their own units, but completely different campaign gameplay. Gone is the ability to take over the entire land. Factions can only take over certain territories that's influenced by the faction's lore. Vampire counts, for example, can only take over regions that contain vampiric corruptions, which is essentially limited to regions where humans dwell. They can destroy other factions' settlements, however, like those pesky dwarven strongholds, but they cannot occupy them. Orcs, however, can occupy strongholds, leaving the dwarfs and orcs vying for the same territory. It's something that's very different from what Total War players will be used to. However, as a Warhammer fan, it makes sense. It can also make the game a lot more tactical. It makes you think more about what you're building, where, and what fronts to man, as well as making the campaign agents far more important than they were in previous Total War games. There are really some interesting faction mechanics that really do make you play each race differently. The orcs have the war mechanic that should your army stay idle for too long, they will start infighting, which will cause you losses. However, stay fighting constantly and a war will eventually initiate, essentially joining the greenskins together so you can have a giant push on your enemies. Chaos, on the other hand, cannot have any settlements. Instead, they rely on looting and raising for their economy, and their technology trees are directly tied to each specific Chaos Horde rather than being tied to an overall faction or an overall settlement. It really is fantastic to see the lore of the universe being implemented on a core design basis. While it can seem restrictive in some ways in terms of campaign expansion, what it actually does is make the campaign not only more tactical, but hugely replayable. Each faction plays so differently, each having their own strengths, weaknesses and methods of progression, that it really does add to the level of replayability that's something that really Total War games have never had previously. The old world campaign map itself is wonderfully detailed and it's littered with landmarks that fans will recognise instantly. At its core, it's still a turn-based Total War campaign map. There's nothing especially new in terms of how it's used other than a few UI changes. Settlements work the same as they did in Rome 2, movement, agent actions, they're all the same. There's less customization in terms of each settlement. Taxing each settlement is gone and instead replaced with provincial commands, in that once you've taken all the settlements in a province and you control that entire province, then you can issue an edict, and one of those edicts is you can tax the land. The game's economy is not correctly balanced yet, mainly due to each faction's economy working very, very differently. Unit upkeep, however, is expensive across the board, and if you don't build lots of income-based buildings, it's likely that you'll run into trouble financially very quickly. It isn't too hard to keep a steady income with the right combination of settlement buildings if your faction can have settlement buildings. However, there is a proverbial glass ceiling. Getting 4 to 5 armies is pretty much at your max at endgame, and it can lead to frustration as trying to simultaneously expand your empire and defend several fronts at the same time with so few armies is nigh on impossible and can lead to a tug of war, a give and take. While I do think unit upkeep should be reduced, the overall design of the economy doesn't need flushed down the toilet, just slightly needs kind of a little bit of a rework. I don't think having tons of armies would do the game any benefit. So few armies forces you to think tactically, seize opportunities, and makes manually engaging in combat much more vital and necessary, as huge losses of auto-resolving can often not be afforded. Ultimately, the economy is probably the game's weakest part, and it does need some adjustment for it to become less frustrating, especially towards the end game. One big addition to the campaign side of things is the addition of story-driven quests that are not only challenging, but provide really powerful, unique equipment for your lords. There is also your standard Total War style missions that have been somewhat improved to better reflect the state of your campaign. Instead of just randomly assigning you missions to somewhere across the map, most missions are given in response to an event. For example, when I was playing as the Vampire Counts, a Dwarven High Lord destroyed one of my towns, and in response I was the next turn given a mission to slay that exact High Lord as revenge for his actions. Missions make so much more thematic sense, and they are a boon to the experience compared to that of previous games. Now, the last major point of the gameplay that I wanted to talk about was the progressions of the lords and agents. Now, each faction lord and agents are actually renamed hero units. They can all take part in battle as an individual unit rather than being tied to a larger unit. And they're actually some of the strongest units in the game. Faction lords are the heads of armies, and heroes can be embedded into armies on top of that. Each levels up and can acquire skill points to be spent in various talent trees depending on who they are. This includes new spells, combat upgrades, and more. Lords can also gain followers and banners, which increase certain stats, and banners can also be applied to army units for a stat increase. Each lord and hero can also equip a variety of items from armor and swords to staffs and mounts. I love the amount of customization each has, and this progression, as well as the unique way in which they are used in battle compared to that of previous Total War games, allows for so much more depth. It's a wonderful addition to the game, and once you complete the story quests for the unique gear, there's nothing more satisfying as seeing it used in the next battle. Now let's get on to the good stuff, the battles. The three major issues I was concerned about coming into the combat were the three basically major breakaways from the previous Total War games: flying units, giant units, and of course, magic. The implementation of flying and giant units has been a great success, which has been massively helped with the huge variety of animations the developers have placed in the game. Engagements look believable, and as a side note, the fact that there's a ton more character models in the game makes the close-up camera moments look fantastic. Neither flying types or giant types feel too overpowered. Yes, they can be some of the strongest unit types in the game and can take a lot of manpower to take down, but they do also have direct counters and can be taken down quickly with the right tactics. Magic seems to have been toned down since the early trailers, and it's no longer a giant destructive force on the battlefield. While high-level spells are going to pack a serious punch, most spells are buffs and debuffs. The overall effect of spells is well balanced. They assist your army and provide opportunities to stem the tide, but they are not powerful enough for you to win the battle by themselves. Magic is also balanced by the Winds of Magic mechanic that determines your overall pool of mana. The winds have changed on the campaign map, so they move into different locations. So some locations will have higher mana pools than others, and then that will change the next turn. The mana system prevents the spamming of spells, so it's best to use your spells sparingly and time them just for the right moment. Other than the unit sizes and large unit variety of each faction, battles still retain that Total War style and feel. Anyone who's played a Total War game before will be right at home, and very little has changed for the most part. One of the most disappointing aspects is that the formations have been taken out. You can still drag formation, but the more complex formations in previous games are no longer there. Now, the reason for this, the developers claim, is that the formations aren't in lore. However, I feel that the inclusion of formations would have been a perfectly fine lore breaker, and it would have certainly added to the enjoyment of the conflicts. The races balance well against each other for the most part. I feel that dwarves seem a tad overpowered at points, and the AI in lower difficulties can be a bit of a mixed bag, as has it been with all Total War games essentially. But I think that the AI does have a huge improvement compared to that of the travesty that was Robe 2. What's interesting to me is that having a fantasy theme helps Total War's core design to make it makes more thematic sense essentially. Giant scale, messy, blood-ridden conflicts are what Warhammer and Total War has always been about, and then combining the two has helped each other shine in a way that they've never done before. That being said, there are some things that don't make sense in the game still, like greenskins having the option to release captives. They wouldn't do that. Some Total War campaigns from the campaign aspects from the previous games kind of show through a little bit from time to time that don't quite fit with what's going on in the world, and it can be a little bit, why did you put that in? It doesn't make any sense, but it's minor problems. There's nothing outright damaging to the core game. Now lastly, I want to touch on the technical aspects of the game in the form of the graphics and sound. Graphically, the game is gorgeous with phenomenal character detail for the units, a variety of models that's pretty much unprecedented in Total War. Now, like I mentioned before, the animations really do sell the battles so well. Bodies flying in the air as a giant slams on the ground is just a visual treat. The game runs into some framerate issues in larger conflicts, particularly on mid-range machines. I played on an i5 with a 970 and I never really had a problem other than the occasional drop in frame rate in Siege Warfare, but other than that it was pretty much smooth sailing 60 frames per second, but I know a lot of people have had frame rate issues and performance problems. Audibly, the game is near perfection. Great voice work, an impressive soundtrack, and a host of sound effects makes the game sound like a Warhammer game should sound. Very little to complain about in that department. So, you're asking what's the recommendation? Well, it certainly gets the Cosmic Engine seal of approval, that is for sure. Total War Warhammer is without a doubt the best Total War game and Warhammer game in years. The attention to detail, progression depth, the replayability of the unique factions, and ultimately the overall quality of the game itself is brilliant. It has met every skeptical thought I've had going in with a giant orc kick to the face. It has a few minor problems here and there, as all do Total War games. It's kind of inherent in the franchise, but it is breaking new ground into the franchise that seems to work for its advantage, and it works for both IPs so well that I'd wish they had done this years ago. It's ultimately creating a Total War game that once I'm finished one campaign, I want to play more because there's something different in there for me to do, and there's something to be said for that. That's unique, that's different for Total War, and I really like this direction they're going in. It's a perfect blend of fantasy and Total War, and I think that I'm glad that this is the first of a trilogy because I cannot wait for the next one. So that is my Total War Warhammer review. Thank you so much for watching and listening. I am giving away a free copy of the game, so there is a link in the description below to the competition. Click that link, go put in your entries, and the winner will be drawn on Friday at 9 PM EST, and I will let the winner know once they have been randomly drawn. So good luck to everybody who enters. Like I say, please do like, share and subscribe, and I will see you next time.